This is lesson 9.5, adding and subtracting rational expressions. This is part 1, and this video will focus on finding the lowest common denominator for preparation for adding and subtracting. So let's think back to how fractions work. After all, rational expressions are just fractions. And so when we add two fractions, or subtract them for that matter, we want to make sure we have a common denominator. Once we have a common denominator, then all we have to do is add together the numerators and then simplify. Down here at the bottom, we do not have a common denominator. We have an 8 and a 6. So what we need to do first is identify that common denominator. And if we think about it, hopefully we're so used to finding common denominators, we can identify that it needs to be a 24. And in order to make this common denominator of 24, we multiply the 8 by 3, and whatever we do on the bottom, we're going to do on the top. So we get 9 over 24 plus, and then 1/6 will multiply by 4 over 4, and we get 4 24ths. Then we add together the numerators, and notice the denominators never change. It's still 24. Up here it was still 8 until we reduced. When we have a rational expression with x's, the same rules are going to apply. In other words, we want to make sure we have a common denominator. And if we have a common denominator, then we just add together the numerators. Down here, we do not have a common denominator. X plus 1 is different than x. And it's not, we can't just go plus 1 and turn it into the same thing. Mathematically, that's not going to work. And so what we need to do, just like for a fraction, with numbers, we need to identify the lowest common denominator. And so while we can't add these two together just yet, eventually we'll be able to. So let's talk about identifying that common denominator. When I have an expression with a variable in the bottom, when I identify the lowest common denominator, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this very first denominator. If it needs to be factored, I'll factor it. Here we just have an x squared. I'm going to take that first denominator and I'm just going to write that down, x squared. And I'm also going to recall that when I say x squared, really what I mean is x times x. So I've written down that first common denominator. Then I'm going to go to my second fraction. And I'm going to look at the denominator of that. If it needs to be factored, I'll factor it. Here we just have an x. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see, in my lowest common denominator, I wrote down x times x. What needs to happen with expressions is I need to have one of each factor appear in my lowest common denominator. So I've already written down an x and an x. Here, in the second fraction, I need another x, but since I already have a single x in my common denominator, I don't need to put another one in. My least common denominator, my lowest common denominator, is just going to be x squared. That's the value that I'm going to use for my denominator. Let's take a look at another example. Here we have a couple of monomials. I'm going to find my lowest common denominator. First, I'm going to look at my numbers. Since I have them out in the front, I need to find the common denominator between 8 and 10. I'm going to call these my lonely numbers. They're not added or subtracted with anything. They're just lonely out in front. And when you have these, identifying the common denominator between 8 and 10, we're going to pretend just like we were adding together the fractions 3/8 and 1/10. Hopefully we would identify that the common denominator, the lowest common denominator, should be a 40. We could multiply 8 by 5 and 10 by 4 to get that 40. So when I start identifying my lowest common denominator, I'm going to consider my lonely numbers first, and I'm going to write down a 40. Now I'm done with my numbers. And so what I'm going to do now is look at my x's and look at the rest of my denominator. I know for a fact that I'm going to need everything in the first denominator. So before I even look at any other fraction, I'm just going to write down x squared y. I need that to be present. Then I'm going to go look at my second denominator. In my second denominator, I have a single x. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to look and see, do I have at least one x? I do. I actually have two of them. So because I already have at least one x, this x has been represented. I don't need to include any more x's. I'm good to go with x. Now I'm going to look at y. I have a y cubed, and we're going to remember that this means I have y times y times y. There are 3 y's multiplied here. In my lowest common denominator, I only have one y. So what I need to do is I need to make sure that I have 3 y's present. So I'm going to add the third power in there, and what that does is it makes it y times y times y, and my lowest common denominator now is 40x squared y cubed. That's my LCD. So now let's take a look at a couple of problems where we're going to need to factor. I'm going to factor pretty quickly in this lesson, so if you need a little bit of factoring help, go back and watch the factoring review video first. But when we factor these two expressions, we're going to make sure we factor everything completely in both fractions, and it's going to look like this. So now that I have completely factored both expressions, the first one x plus 2, the second one I actually factored twice. When I did my greatest common factor of 5, I got x squared minus 4, which is a difference of squares, so I factored that into x plus 2, x minus 2. Now I'm ready to identify my lowest common denominator. And just like I have been doing, I'm going to take this first entire denominator and I'm going to write that down, because I know that everything in that denominator needs to at least be in my LCD. Now I'm going to go over to my other denominator. I have a 5. Well, I don't have that written down yet, so I'm going to write down 5. I have an x plus 2. I already have one, at least one. I actually have 2, but I only need at least one to cover this x plus 2 over here. So I'm good to go. I don't need to write another one. But x minus 2, I haven't written that down, so I'm going to write that down. And once I've represented all the factors, I'm good to go. That's my common denominator that I'll need to get in order to add or subtract. Now let's take a look at this problem. Again, I'm going to factor kind of quickly, and it'll look like this. You'll notice I had a greatest common factor on the left, and on the right I had a greatest common factor, which then I was left with another difference of squares. So I had to factor this the one on the right twice. So once it's factored, now I'm going to start writing down my common denominator. And so my common denominator, first I'm going to start with my lonely numbers out here. I have a 3 and a 6. Lonely numbers, remember, are things that are not added or subtracted with anything. They're all by themselves. And so when I consider the common denominator for 3 and 6, I'm going to think of it as, what if I were adding 1/3 and 1/6 together? I would need a common denominator of 6 as my common denominator. So in my lowest common denominator for my lonely numbers, I'm going to write down 6. Now I'm ready to go look at the other factors that have x's in them. So I'm going to start out always by writing down the entire rest of this whole first denominator. I know I need an x and an x minus 5. I have to write that down. Now I'm going to go over to the other side. This one has an x plus 5. I haven't written that down, so I'm going to write that down. It also has an x minus 5. I've already written that down one time. I only need one over here, so I'm good to go. This right here is my lowest common denominator. Again, here are some expressions that we need to get factored, and it'll look like this. So when I factor the left, it's a trinomial. I can factor it into x minus 8 and x minus 4. And on the right-hand side, here we have a difference of cubes. So there's a formula that we use. And again, if you don't have that handy, make sure you go back and watch that factoring video for a little help on factoring differences of cubes. But we're going to use that formula there. And now we're ready to write down our LCD. Again, I'm going to write down the entire first denominator. So this whole entire thing, x minus 8, x minus 4, that has to be there. Now I'm going to go, I need an x minus 4. I have one, but I do not have an x squared plus 4x plus 16. So I'm going to write that down, and once I've represented all my factors, I know I have my common denominator. One last example. This time we're going to have 3 to figure out. But that's okay. We can figure 3 out the same way we figure 2 out. And as always, the first thing we're going to do is to factor. So again, I factored kind of quickly. The first one is a trinomial. We can factor it by undoing the FOIL. The second one is a trinomial, and the third one had a greatest common factor of x, so I factored that out. So now what I'm going to do is identify my lowest common denominator. And again, nothing changes here. Even though we have 3, I'm still going to write down the first denominator, 2x minus 5 and x plus 3. I need those in there, so I'm good to go on my first one. Now my second one. I need an x plus 3. I have an x plus 3, but I need also a second x plus 3. And since I only have 1 in my common denominator, I'm going to write another one down. Because if this denominator has 2 of them, I need 2 of them also in my common denominator. Over here, my last expression, it has a single x, so I'm going to write down a single x, and I like to write those in the front. So here's my single x over here, and then it needs a 2x minus 5. Well, I already have one, so I don't need to write another one because there's only one here, so I only need one here. So now that I've covered all of my factors, this right here is my lowest common denominator.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.